to this web seminar. And we will have the pleasure of listening today to Professor Piotr Sadowski on systemic semiotics. Professor Sadowski is from the Department of Film and Creative Media in the Dublin Business School. And he's also a visiting research fellow at the Trinity College at Dublin, okay? He has authored 8 books on cinema, semiotics, communication theory. His talk is the topic of one of his books, which is called Systemic Semiotics, a deductive study of communication and meaning. Now, the structure, we will try to do the following structure. Professor Sadowski will speak between 40 to 50 minutes, and then we have 7 panelists, and each panelist has from 5 to 10 minutes to make the comments and ask for the questions. Now, the questions will only be answered when the 7th panelist got through their comments. Okay. So, with nothing else to say, Professor Sadowski, please.
Thank you very much, Monica. Let me jump straight into my presentation. There it is. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Piotr Sadowski, as Monica has kindly stated. I want to talk today about systemic semiotics. Systemic semiotics is an approach to communication and meaning based on the concept of the autonomous system. Sorry. I want to change the slides. Oh, yeah, there it is. Yeah. I'm using the autonomous system as an abstraction for any empirical entity equipped with the capacity to maintain homeostasis, that is, an internal functional equilibrium in respect of the processed information and energy. Autonomous systems represented by all living organisms are self-regulating, and their behavior can be described as purposeful and goal-oriented. What motivates an autonomous system's behavior are needs. A need can be defined as a temporary disturbance of the system's functional equilibrium caused either by a deficiency or excess of required information or energy. Examples of needs are, of course, legion, but their types are in fact limited in number. Needs can be generally divided into dynamic, those involving primarily energy, and cognitive, those involving primarily information. The needs and the areas of experience they reflect are responsible for the purpose and meaning of all communication among autonomous systems, and as such, they define the total subject matter of semiosis. On a continuum between dynamic needs and cognitive needs, the main areas of experience of autonomous systems include the following. To start with, all living systems with time slow down processing information and energy and eventually die. Termination of life constitutes, of course, a final and irreversible disturbance of the system's functional equilibrium. The only available way to ensure continuity of existence of sorts is to reproduce biologically, to create, if not an identical, then at least a genetically related organism. The need to extend one's individual existence beyond one's demise will be called procreative. It is accordingly the most dynamic of needs, motivated by powerful instincts and emotions, and least subject to volitional control. Secondly, to support its internal physiological processes, an autonomous system needs regular intakes of energy captured in foodstuffs obtained from the environment. The related cognitive components include the ability to recognize edible things in the environment, the skills of producing and processing food, and the related culinary culture. The dynamic need in question is, of course, the nutritional one. Thirdly, to survive, autonomous systems must avoid or counteract dynamic inputs potentially dangerous to their bodily integrity. To avoid being injured or killed, living systems have evolved intuitive physics and biology, which help them to negotiate safely their way in the natural and social environments. Fear and aggression and the associated reactions of fight or flight are the expected emotional components of what can be called the protective need. Fourthly, autonomous systems also maximize their fitness by forming groups to exchange useful knowledge and resources with other group members. The most common groupings involve genetically related individuals, as in the family, where positive sum cooperation benefits everyone's life interests. Larger social systems involve ethnic communities, professional and religious groups, political parties, nations, and ultimately, in an increasingly globalized and interconnected world, the entire humankind. The social need is supported by several innate cognitive modules, including one responsible for cooperation and altruism, another for competition and rivalry, theory of mind to second-guess the social partner's intentions, the body language module, the language faculty, and so on. In addition to benefiting from social cooperation, humans also negotiate their way around the wider non-social environment and its resources. It is typical for most animals whose natural mobility is an evolutionary result of their exploratory behavior to search the environment for thinly distributed foodstuffs, for mating opportunities and shelter, and to test one's responses to new situations, often by random curiosity and playful behavior. The underlying cognitive need will accordingly be called exploratory, supported by such emotions as curiosity and excitement of discovery. The emotions elicited by the natural environment are prompted by sensory perceptions of the manifold features of objects such as shape, size, texture, color, sound, smell, and taste. We find flowers, green landscapes, and sunny days lovely because these environmental features have enhanced human life during evolution. And we find barren terrain with nothing but rocks, sand, or snow forbidding and uninviting because it does not support habitation and nourishment. The emotions elicited by nature, often hard to verbalize, are known to everyone, including, of course, poets, painters, and musicians, whose role it is precisely to express in works of art the elusive and subtle feelings originally aroused by our ancestors' experience of their environment. The cognitive need to emotionally assess the various environmental features will be called aesthetic. Finally, it is possible to postulate another important cognitive need, at least among humans. The sustained observation of the regularities in the cosmic, natural, and social domains can lead to reflection regarding their likely causes and purposes. The human conscious mind is capable of formulating questions about the origins and goals of things, of life, natural and social, individual and collective, and of the entire universe. Human cognition, detached from the immediate existential concerns, requires not only the ability to have ideas about things, but also to have ideas about ideas, a metacognitive faculty that enables humans to speculate about the origin, purpose, and meaning of everything that surrounds them in their daily interactions with the world. Consequently, the cognitive need related to the search for the purpose and meaning in life will be called teleological, from the Greek word telos, meaning goal. It has been historically served by such human phenomena as religion, philosophy, fictional storytelling, individual introspection, art, and science. The 7 distinguished types of needs, procreative, nutritional, protective, social, exploratory, aesthetic, and teleological, extended on the scale from the most dynamic to the most cognitive, appear to represent the totality of the motives behind the behavior of autonomous systems and encompass all possible areas of communication. While the types of needs as the ultimate motivators of behavior remain the same everywhere, their manifestations will of course vary from individual to individual, from culture to culture. For instance, most people enjoy having children, although some are more inclined to children-free life or towards celibacy. Individual tastes in food also differ within the range of what is edible and locally available, what the culinary culture recommends, and what religious food taboos permit. Levels of sociability likewise differ between individuals, and all societies have developed specific and complicated systems of kin relations, communal life, customs, and power hierarchies to enhance group cohesion and identity. Curiosity about the social and non-human environments is variously satisfied depending on individual inclination and available educational opportunities. Equally individual is sensitivity to order and harmony found in music, visual arts, literature, and nature at large, as are the local practices of artistic creativity. Finally, all people want to see purpose and meaning in their lives, in the destiny of their near and dear, and of their community. These teleological yearnings are expressed everywhere in personal reflection, organized religion, philosophical speculation, and political ideologies, which set specific long-term goals for their communities and prescribe practical means for their attainment. The semiotic domains related to the 7 needs involve social circulation of information, in other words, communication. A single communicative act, such as a casual verbal exchange, a literary description, a media report, a work of art, and so on, can relate to one of the 7 needs or to any combination of them at the same time. For example, the aesthetic appreciation of the natural environment is directly linked to the recognition of its protective and nutritional qualities. Sociability, too, is in an obvious way bound up with cooperation required to maximize the satisfaction of the protective, nutritional, and procreative needs, just as teleology provides additional reasons for integrating groups around common values, identities, and destinies. A semiotic analysis would thus consist in identifying both the underlying needs as part of the universal human nature and their individual and locally specific expressions. These innate motivations and their cultural manifestations thus determine the content and purpose, the what and the why of communication. Let us now consider the how of communication process. What physically happens between communicating systems, how information is transmitted from individual to individual, and how communication affects the behavior of the systems involved. The default of all communication among autonomous systems is contiguity, an unmediated exchange of information between systems remaining within each other's natural sensory range and sharing the same space and time. Examples are omnipresent. Male deer locking horns, people sitting together at a table, strangers exchanging glances, people shaking hands, and so on. Direct contiguity is the most common and universal form of communication. It is also a prerequisite of mediated forms of communication. As I speak now, we are of course not sharing the same space, although we are sharing the same time, but each of us interacts contiguously with the computer as a technological mediator in our webinar. By contrast, pure contiguity relies solely on unaided and unmediated natural sensory apparatus. Obvious and even banal to contemplate as contiguity is, it is fundamentally important in communication because it is real, and someone's life may literally depend upon it. In indirect forms of communication, of which in a moment, relying on displaced reference are about inferred and imagined distant threats and opportunities, whereas contiguity is what confronts living systems face to face with immediate existential consequences. Given the involvement of space and time in the relations between co-communicating systems, it is possible to distinguish 3 subcategories of contiguous communication. The most common is the one I described above, when interacting systems share the same time and space, what can be called fully contiguous communication. When interacting systems share the same space, but not the simultaneity, we are dealing with spatially contiguous communication. This happens when an archaeologist finds an ancient artifact, or when we rummage through the contents of an old drawer. Spatially contiguous communication, a domain of nostalgia in historical sciences, tantalizes the imagination by its combination of direct physical contact and elusiveness of past meaning. Spatially contiguous communication seems also limited to humans, with their metacognitive powers of extended working memory and secondary mental representations. The psychological prerequisites of the ability to mentally reconstruct the past. The urge to transcend the present imaginatively underlies not only historical sciences, but also the time machine and back to the future types of fiction, in which wide-eyed scientists, aided by eccentric gadgetry, transport themselves to a chosen location, either in the past or the future. The same cognitive disposition explains what anthropologists call contagious magic, a fetishist obsession with relics and memorabilia, in which an object is invested with special emotional or mystical significance because of its earlier direct contact with an important person, a saint's bone, an old handwritten letter, and auctioneer's lots, such as Jimi Hendrix's guitar or Marilyn Monroe's crystal emblazoned dress in which she sang, "Happy Birthday, Mr. President." Finally, when interacting systems share the same time but not the spatial proximity, we are dealing with simultaneously contiguous communication. Examples include talking over the phone or having a video meeting using telecommunication applications such as Zoom or Skype. Underlying these inventions is a universal social need to transcend the limitations of space and communicate directly with displaced persons. A disposition also found in the fantasy of teleportation, in which magicians vanish at will to reappear instantly at some other location. Spiritual mediums also claim to summon spirits of the dead from their otherworldly abodes to reconnect them with the living. For all we know, non-human animals do not speculate about locations other than the one in which they find themselves at the moment, nor can they consciously remember the past or imagine the future. And so they have no interest in engaging in communication with anything other than the immediate here and now. Notwithstanding the importance attached in media and cultural studies to telecommunication technologies, such as television, the internet, radio, social media, as well as visual arts and traditional print culture, the bulk of human communication still occurs through direct, spontaneous, and universal social interaction. No matter how much time we spend daily switching through TV channels or surfing the net, we still enjoy a face-to-face chat and gossip with family and friends, and we love social gatherings in public spaces. One of the important things that the social distancing during the coronavirus pandemic has reminded us of is how vital to our mental well-being and social cohesion direct multisensory human contact is, and how frustrating imposed reduction of contiguity can be. The difference between a physical social gathering and a Zoom meeting is like a difference between trekking the countryside, breathing its air while feeling the earth under one's feet, and contemplating landscape photographs or nature documentaries. Fundamental as full contiguity is as the default of human communication, it is, by its nature, limited to the here and now. But in human history, as groups and communities grew in size and collective knowledge expanded, it became advantageous to pull that knowledge from across wider territories, as well as from collective past experience. In other words, to transcend the limitations of space and time. The uniquely human faculty of working memory enables us to make connections between past and present and to identify the causes and effects in the world, a cognitive skill that has added flexibility to the rigid and largely automatic, instinctive, animal-like responses to the environment. It can be postulated that the first step towards consciously linking the past with the present was to make mental connections between past objects and events and their current traces, what we call, after Charles Saunders Peirce, indexes. An index is simply a physical change caused by an object in the environment. A crater in the ground caused by an exploded bomb is an index of that bomb. A footprint, handwriting, recorded voice, or a photograph are indexes of persons represented in these records. In other words, as a physical extension or trace, an index is a partial but truthful representation of an object. Interacting with indexes means interacting indirectly with the objects that caused them. And so indexical communication, unlike contiguous communication, is already mediated and referential. As with contiguous communication, it is possible to distinguish three subcategories of indexical communication. When systems interact by means of an index while remaining within the same proximate time and space, we are dealing with contiguously indexical communication. The mercury in a barometer is an index of a current atmospheric pressure, which causes the mercury to expand or contract. During a face-to-face conversation, we are technically communicating through the voice as a contiguous index. This indexical mediation becomes apparent when the conversation is taking place in the dark, for example, and we are anxiously inferring someone's near presence from the voice. A cast shadow of an object is a contiguous index of that object. When communicating systems share the same time, but not the spatial proximity, we are dealing with simultaneous indexical communication. In a telephone conversation, the voice is an index of a faraway caller, just as in a video call, a moving image on the LCD screen provides a simultaneous visual index. Finally, when interacting systems share proximity but not simultaneity, we are dealing with spatially indexical communication, probably the most important form of indexicality because most distinct from fully contiguous communication. Examples include footprints, steel impressions, death masks, photographs, film footage, voice recordings, and so on. Unlike contiguous indexes, spatial indexes do not normally provoke anxious or panicky feelings, but rather relaxed curiosity due to the safe temporal distance between the index and its core. It is the difference between enjoying a nature film and confronting directly a large cat in the African savanna. Indexicality is still tied to animal-like, real-time physical interactions with the proximate environment. But as human groups grew larger and people had to keep up with more knowledge from across wider spatial and temporal domains, more effective indirect types of communication had to be invented. One way to transcend the limitations of indexicality is to free the stimulus from its physical dependence on the object. The stimulus can still be related to the object, not through physical causality, however, but through cognitive associations based on perceived similarity between stimulus and object. A stimulus that only subjectively resembles an object, but with which it has otherwise no objective causal relationship, will be called, again after Peirce, an index. An icon of that object, and interacting by means of icons will be referred to as iconic communication. In other words, icons rely on mental representations of objects rather than on the object's physical traces. Iconicity can be regarded as the first step towards metacognition, that is, the ability to have associations about associations. If indexical communication is still limited to inferences from perception, iconicity is more wide-ranging because it relies on the interpretations of perception based on similarity and comparisons with other perceptions. A realistically painted portrait bears a resemblance formed in the artist's and viewer's minds to the sitter, despite not being caused by or physically connected to the sitter in any way. Antonio Vivaldi's Concerto No. 1, La Primavera, contains instrumental imitations of birdsong and the spring storm. The English word splash conveys onomatopoeically the sound made by a heavy object hitting the surface of the water. Similarity, analogy, and imitation are the essence of iconic thinking and communication. As with contiguous and indexical communication, it is possible to distinguish three subcategories of iconic communication. When an icon shares the same spatio-temporal context as the thing it is referring to, we are dealing with contiguous iconic communication. This is what happens when I'm making a circle with my finger at my temple to indicate that a person standing next to me is mixed up or crazy. When an icon shares the same time but not the spatial proximity with the thing it is referring to, we are dealing with simultaneous iconic communication, as in watching a live TV broadcast in which images on the screen resemble the actual distant events. Finally, when an icon is neither proximate nor simultaneous with its referent, we are dealing with displaced iconic communication, probably the most important form of iconicity because most distinct from contiguous communication. History of figurative art, for example, is dealing mainly with iconic images of spatio-temporally displaced persons, objects, and places. Nor is iconic communication limited to metacognitive humans. Genetically programmed iconicity underlies animal mimicry, for example. Stick insects fool their predators by evolving body shapes that make them indistinguishable from the inedible twigs and branches that surround them. The chemical warning signals used by some ants have an iconic quality. The greater the danger, the longer and stronger the dose of pheromone released to the colony. A famous example of visual displaced iconic communication among insects is the dance language of honeybees, which inform each other about the availability of food by correlating the number of turns and speed of their waggle dance with information about the food's location, direction, and distance from the hive. Just as associating objects and events through similarity offers a more efficient form of communication than one limited to physical traces of objects, so it is possible to imagine an even more detached form of indirect communication, in which a stimulus bears neither causal nor perceptual relation to its referent. In both indexical and iconic communication, the properties of the object constrain the form of the sign, thus reducing the frequency of signal change, and in consequence, its communicative efficiency, as less information is exchanged in a unit of time. A form of communication freed from these constraints, and therefore more efficient, would require a stimulus that is related to the object only through arbitrary mental associations. As we know, human verbal language is the most spectacular example of such a system of communication, where a vocal signal has, as a rule, hardly any physical or formal relationship with what it refers to. An object's name is not an icon, still less is it a physical part or a trace of the object. A photographed or painted rose does look like a rose, and the eau de rosé fragrance oil offers an imitation of a rich rose scent. But, as Shakespeare's Juliet famously said, what's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other word would smell as sweet. As we know, communication based on arbitrary associations between stimuli and their referents is called symbolic. The symbolic signs of language refer to things following a conventional, language-specific association between a vocal sound or a written character and its mental equivalent, which in turn may refer to an object in the outside world. To recapitulate, autonomous systems communicate by exchanging the needed information and energy. Information is communicated either directly, as in contiguous communication, or indirectly by means of indexes, icons, and symbols, each offering a different form of connection between the stimulus and its meaning, physical, imitative, and arbitrary, respectively. Exchange of information is what happens between interacting systems. Let us now look at what happens inside the systems during communication. As autonomous systems receive information, they process it internally, that is, they interpret it for its usefulness. An internal reaction to the stimulus is formed, which can be called parainformation. a direct literal meaning of received information. Parainformation can be either innate or acquired. The evolved reactions to certain typical environmental situations are the source of innate parainformation, as in reacting with fear to darkness and large cats, or with pleasure to pretty landscapes. Examples of acquired parainformation include understanding one's native language or social custom. During communication, when sender and receiver share the same parainformation relating to given information, we are talking about mutual understanding. Most interpersonal and communal life consists of mutually intelligible communication, which is what ensures social cohesion and cooperation in joint tasks. But autonomous systems are autonomous because the structure of their parainformation is unique, not always shared with other systems. Incompatibility between individual parainformation can lead to three types of miscommunication. The first one, the sender possesses parainformation, but the receiver has no parainformation relating to the same information, what we call incomprehension. This happens when we hear a language that is foreign to us, or when we have no knowledge of a particular subject matter. I don't know what you're talking about, kind of response. Secondly, another type of miscommunication happens when the sender does not possess any parainformation relating to the communicated information, but the receiver does. This is called overinterpretation. To give a fictitious example, in a British film comedy from 1961, Carry On Regardless, a sophisticated lady with a winking tic in one eye is in conversation with a gentleman who mistakes the involuntary reflex for an intentional social signal with obvious comic consequences. In the third type of miscommunication, both sender and receiver possess parainformation relating to the same information, but it is in both cases different. It's what we call misunderstanding. For example, Bulgarians traditionally shake their heads from side to side when they mean yes, and they nod when they mean no. A single act of communication will be either a case of understanding, incomprehension, overinterpretation, or misunderstanding. Communication and miscommunication both occur in situations when systems are willing to understand one another and cooperate. But as we know, the real world is one of limited resources needed for survival, where interactions often depend on rivalry and competition as well as on cooperation. If sharing truthful knowledge helps in cooperative activities, hiding or misrepresenting information is often a viable strategy in the struggle for such vital commodities as sex, food, and safety, or money that can buy all these things. Opportunities for withholding or misrepresenting information in the competitive game of life are indeed broad, as are skills at lying and deceiving depressingly illustrate. Deception is, of course, not the same thing as unintended miscommunication. Rather, it is intentional disinformation. In deceptive interaction, at least one system hides information or falsifies its meaning. For example, a sender may communicate meaningless information, that is with no parainformation attached to it, to provoke in the receiver some desired false information, false parainformation, as in making affirmative statements about non-existent events. I saw it with my own eyes when nothing happened. Or in signaling absent emotions or states of mind, as in saying with due respect, when it's obvious that respect is lacking. Presenting meaningless information as meaningful is what we call fabrication, as in lying, pretending, faking, conning. When the sender possesses meaningful information but does not communicate it to the receiver, we are talking about suppression of information. Examples include animal camouflage, also used in human warfare, as a deceptive tactic designed to make the sender blend with the surroundings to escape the attention of predators or enemies. Failing to produce evidence, keeping silent, looking the other way, hiding, playing dead, and so on are examples of suppression of information. It is also possible to distinguish a form of deception that combines suppression with fabrication, when the sender possesses meaningful information which he does not communicate to the receiver, but instead manipulates the receiver into accepting meaningless information. This type of deception will be called substitution, as in counterfeiting money, cheating during exams, forging works of art, or accusing others of one's own crimes and misdemeanors. A vainglorious liar will fabricate his non-existent achievements to suppress the fact that he has achieved nothing of note. Human deception presupposes the awareness of other people's states of mind and often exploits their self-deception arising from their desires and expectations. Animal deception, on the other hand, does not necessarily presuppose such advanced cognitive faculties, but is instead the result of trials and errors of natural selection, whereby an animal that has developed mimicry has better chances of surviving and reproducing than an animal visible to potential predators. Parainformation as an internal reaction to perceived information is the communication default of all autonomous systems, from amoebas to humans. In non-human species, differences in the complexity of the nervous system appear to be largely quantitative, reflecting the species' adaptation to a particular environmental niche. A possible qualitative rival to communication based on parainformation would involve the ability to react not only to external stimuli, but also to internal ones. Consequently, these second-order associations will be called meta-information. The two forms of communication, one limited to parainformation and the other extended to meta-information, will be referred to as levels of meaning. The fundamental difference between parainformation and meta-information is that while the former is prompted by external stimuli, the latter depends mainly on internal cognitive processes, even independently from perception and contiguous experience. Meta-information may either assume the form of extended thoughts and reflections about the outside world via parainformation, or it can be generated from within as an internal monologue, daydreaming, being lost in thought, engaged in creative imagination, or in experiencing delusions. Dreaming during sleep is a classic example of spontaneous metacognitive activity of the brain in the absence of sensory inputs. If parainformation is necessarily constrained by perception and therefore semantically limited, the meanings generated by meta-information are practically unlimited, as having thoughts about thoughts is recursive and combinatorial ab infinitum, forever flexible and creative. Philosophy and art, for example, are essentially meta-informational phenomena, while sciences are mainly a domain of parainformation. Or if parainformation is the meaning of information, that is of factual reality, meta-information consists in reflection, imagination, belief, and theorizing. Meta-information also underlies irony, humor, sarcasm, illusion, and metaphor, as well as reminiscing, long-term planning, having attitudes, agendas, values, biases, and prejudices. The distinction between parainformation and meta-information is also what is often referred to as a literal explicit meaning versus metaphorical implicit meaning, or denotation versus connotation, respectively. In a word, metacognition defines human mental life and its relative independence from the constraints of perception and the tyranny of facts. Non-human animals are forever enslaved to the here and now and cannot but react appropriately to the situation, whereas we have a choice to do right or wrong. We can pretend if we choose to, unlike other animals, which never pretend, because in the absence of metacognition, they have no option but to run on automatic innate responses determined by current circumstances. As with parainformation, metainformation can involve the following types of communication and miscommunication. Understanding, when an illusion, understatement, or metaphor as intended by the sender is correctly interpreted by the receiver. Oh, I see what you mean, kind of response. Incomprehension, when meta-information is lost on the receiver, who is unable to interpret an illusion or understatement due to insufficient social or cultural competence. I don't get it, kind of response. Over-interpretation, when the receiver interprets a literal message as an implicit one, as in suspecting an illusion or sarcasm where there is none, out of emotional insecurity, for example. And misunderstanding, when sender and receiver have different meta-associations attached to the same message. For example, a work of art may provoke equally valid but different responses resulting from individual differences in knowledge, sensitivity, and life experience. Let me finish by proposing a number of other hopefully useful concepts and definitions relating to communication and meaning within the framework of systemic semiotics sketched above. Inanimate systems such as minerals, stones, rocks, earth, water, inertly exchange physical states in the form of mechanical forces, chemical reactions, and radiation. Autonomous systems such as plants and animals communicate purposefully by exchanging, interpreting, and reacting to information on the first order level of parainformation, while humans avail additionally of second order meta communication. First order communication can be of two kinds, depending on the involvement of intentionality. Intentionality presupposes active and goal-oriented behavior, which can be either innate, as in plants and animals, and both innate and volitional, as in humans. Intentional first-order communication uses active signals, whereas unintentional first-order communication relies on passive cues in the form of phenotypic features such as body size, shape, and color. For example, the greenness of leaves is a passive cue, a consequence of the color of chlorophyll, a chemical involved in photosynthesis, which just happens to be green. On the other hand, brightly colored flowers evolved by plants to attract pollinating insects are active signals. An unintentional, as in cues, but active, like signals, first-order communication will be called a symptom. Symptoms are automatic reactions motivated by an emotional or physiological state, such as sweating from overheating, trembling from fear, and blushing from shame. Human communication involves both first and second order levels of meaning and can be of three kinds, depending on the involvement of intentionality. First type, unintentional first order communication consisting of cues and symptoms, as reflected in bodily anatomy and physiological reactions, respectively. Second, intentional first order communication expressed through signals, as in making eye contact, smiling, or hitting someone. Third, second order communication, which is by definition intentional, relying on signs at last, as in avoiding eye contact, smiling sarcastically, using symbolic verbal language, dressing up for the occasion, painting a picture, or taking a photograph. In this understanding, signs are used only in metacommunication, reserved in practice to humans. Human behavior covers, therefore, the entire range of the distinguished types of communication and levels of meaning. We constantly exchange physical states with the natural environment by exploiting its resources. In social communication, we inadvertently display bodily cues involving sexual dimorphism, skin color, age, and individual, especially facial differences. We signal our intentions using body language, facial expressions, gestures, and denotative speech. We develop involuntary physiological symptoms, such as perspiring, yawning, sneezing, or crying. And we produce metacognitive signs through bodily adornments, such as makeup, jewelry, and clothes to emphasize our identity and status, through metaphor, irony, and humor in speech and playful behavior, and through literature, philosophy, music, and visual arts in a broader social context. The above list of definitions derived from the systemic semiotics model is probably incomplete, but I hope it is useful and helpful in accounting for instances of communication in the empirical world. And yes, there is a book published last year in Paul Buissac's Bloomsbury Advances in Semiotics series. My thanks to Paul for his vision and encouragement, and for you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sadowski. It was very insightful, and there is a lot of information about all kinds of communication. So let's hear our panelists. I will call them in no specific order. Let's start with Remo Gramigna. He's a professor of semiotics at the University of Torino. He's also author of several papers on fake news and deceptive communication.
Hello to everybody and good afternoon. Thanks a lot for your presentation. And I would have a few questions for you. The first one is about the very title of your talk, so systemic semiotics. My comment and question would be the following. The first time I heard about this terminology, systemic coupled with the word semiotics, came from a book which I have with me, which is in Italian, and it's called La semiotica nei paesi slavi, semiotics in the Slavic countries. It's quite an old book. It's from the 70s, and it was basically summing up the developments during the 60s and 70s of semiotics in the former Soviet countries. And it was talking about systemic semiotics, especially with reference to the so-called Tartu Moscow semiotic school. As you know, in that strand of semiotics, cultural semiotics is seen as a sort of system of systems, in which indeed the key word is systems. So I was wondering whether your terminology is in a way a novelty, or it has some connections also with the way in which the term has been used in other strands and other fields of semiotics in the past. This leads me to my second comment and question, which is related to the connection between your own interpretation of systemic semiotics with the current subfield called biosemiotics. In particular, I'm referring to the works of Kalevi-Kuhl and Timo Maran, and as well as the older Thomas E. Sibiok. So I'm wondering whether, how do you place yourself within these fields? This leads me to my third and fourth comment. One is about the typology. You have nicely pointed out the threefold typology of indexes within the type of sign which you refer to as index, and the other type which you refer to as iconic communication, right? So if I had to use your own typology in order to make sense of what is going on at the moment, especially with reference to artificial intelligence, okay, so we would have something that is literally an image, so an icon without a referent. So let us take, for instance, synthetic photo or a synthetic image, better, which is completely created ex nihilo, and which is not a sign of any referent. Okay, I give you an example. There is a famous website called "This Person Does Not Exist," in which there is an array of several pictures which are very much likes of human faces, but they do not correspond to anybody in particular. So I was wondering, how can we make sense of those types of communication or of those type of icons within your own typology? Could could those types of images be called displaced icons, or do we need to use other types of terminology in order to refer to these new types of signs? Because my interest in this question is the following. As you know, Baudrillard and other postmodernists argue that with the advent of digital photography and digital images, there has been a sort of a loss of indexicality. And as you know, they argue that digital photography does not have actually a referent. So I was wondering, what is your take about this issue of synthetic images, digitally created images, and whether we can still trace an idea of indexicality, whatever sort of indexicality can be traced in there, in these images. Last point, sorry, I've been a bit long. The last point, which was very fascinating for me, was the threefold division you made about types of incomprehension. So you called it incompatibility of parainformation, okay? Incomprehension was the first, over-interpretation was the second, and misunderstanding was the third. Again, looking back at some former and older semioticians, I name one, Yuri Lotman, for instance. He argued quite the opposite, namely that in order to have novelty and in order to create new texts in culture, there has to be one criteria, which is indeed the incompatibility or the untranslatability of codes and languages. So in a way, he argues that, yes, understanding is very important, but misunderstanding perhaps is even more important than understanding, in as much as it creates something new, which it stems from exactly the mutual untranslatability of those codes. So I was tinkering a bit with this idea, and I was wondering what you think about this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Raminha. Let's hear now Ramon Esqueda, who is professor at the Universidade Autônoma Metropolitana and director of Neuro Research Center for Marketing in Mexico.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Piotr, for your very interesting talk. Well, I just wanted to point out two things that I'm very interested in your talk. I work a lot with trying to develop cognitive neuroscience with semiotics. So this is like my perspective, and that's what I'm going to point out about this. And my first question would be about communication theories and theoreticians who have been criticizing our models of communication in the last 20 years, and who have been analyzing critically, being themselves theoreticians of communications. They tend to be thinking about a reflection, what communication means. So they are criticizing the concept of communication from within. Let's say they're not sure what communication is. So I would like to ask you, what do you think about this in the context of your talk? And how do you deal with this kind of criticism that comes from communication theory itself? Because you know, they're like questioning that we have been talking about communication all these years and making communication theories, but we haven't a clear concept of communication yet. So what are we doing? You know, like they're falling into this kind of trap there. So I would like to know what you think about this. And the other thing I would like to talk about is the first part of your talk, when you talk about homeostasis and all of this. As you know, some neuroscientists have been working on this subject as well. For example, Antonio Damasio, in his work from 2018, The Strange Order of Things, where he says, for example, that feelings are the mental expressions of homeostasis. So in the brain, according to Damasio's theory, feelings are central to homeostasis. But then in your talk, you seem, at least from my point of view, and this is what I would like to talk about, what I would like you to talk about, there's not much reference to feelings. And according to Damasio, feelings are central to homeostasis in the brain. So from this perspective, I would like to ask you please to expand a little bit on this subject, and how do you feel about this way of talking about homeostasis in the brain and how feelings are central. And let me just quote a little bit of Damasio here, because what he says is that homeostasis has to do with moving biological entities to do things. That feelings are what move us to act somehow. And he says, why would feelings succeed in moving the mind to act in such an advantageous manner? He was talking about moving ourselves to act. And he says, one reason comes from what feelings accomplish in the mind and do to the mind. In standard circumstances, feelings tell the mind, without any word being spoken, of the good or bad direction of the life process at any moment within its respective body. So for him, homeostasis has a lot to do with this. Let me expand the argument. Non-informational thing that are feelings. Feelings seems to be central, at least from the neuroscientific point of view, are central to semiosis, I would say. But what do you think about this? I would like you to expand a little bit on this, about how feelings fit into your proposal, and how, if it's the case, I'm not sure if you're interested in this, but how does the homeostatic concept fits within neuroscientific approaches to this experience, and how would semiotics fit into this kind of system? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Izquierda. Now let's hear Dr. Robert Finkelstein. He teaches robotics at the University of Maryland and is founder and CEO of Robotics Technology.
Yes, I'd like to make a correction that what I'm teaching currently is systems engineering, not robotics yet. I haven't taught robotics though in the past. I have be interested in learning your view on the following, that autonomous intelligent machines will communicate with humans in general, like humans do, although without certain other types of communication. For example, there might be, with machines, it might not be possible to have visual signals given to a human that it's communicating with. So it might be just a verbal communication, but machines, intelligent autonomous machines, are unlikely to communicate with each other like people do. In fact, machines have the equivalent of what people would call extrasensory perception. That is, they have the ability to communicate directly with each other at the speed of light, such as with radio frequency communication, and anywhere around the globe, or maybe elsewhere in space, for example. So they can transmit to each other not only information in terms of data, but also images directly from one machine mind to another. So this will be a very drastically different way of communicating, and the content of that communications may be drastically different from what we used to. It might be something that might resemble that of communications among aliens from some other planet at some point. And if they evolve, these autonomous intelligent machines, their communication might become completely incomprehensible to us at some point. We might be lacking, they might lack transparency in terms of allowing us to understand what they're communicating with each other. So that's something that I would be interested in your view on.
Thank you for your comment and questions. Now let's hear Jean-Guy Meunier. He's an emeritus professor at the Université du Québec à Montréal, and his most recent book is on confrontational semiotics.
Thank you very much for this fascinating presentation and reflection, and I would say synthesis on homeostatic systems and organisms. I have 2 points that I would like to discuss with you to give me some answers. What I find fascinating is the complexity of the conceptual model you present for the, I'd say, describing or explaining intelligent organisms, or that is organisms that communicate, but we add to them, or we talk about it by adding this property of being intelligent. The impression I have, maybe I'm wrong on that, is that to be an intelligent organism like humans is not only just to reason or explain certain things or capture certain things. The core of the argument is they have to communicate. And when they communicate, they have this panoply of dimensions and properties that the artificial intelligence aspect doesn't always bring in the portrait. I find this very fascinating, and you use the main concept of semiotics and signs to show where we can unwrap this complexity. Communication is not just communicating statements that are formal or mathematical or natural language. They have this manifold of types of signs, and you show the differences that are involved in this, I'd say, this communicative intelligence. The message I receive is that when you're an intelligent organism, you're not just reasoning. You have this strong context of communication. You may be just reasoning, but you're not as a rich human, even a rich animal. I could imagine just a dog that could not communicate and just could find his bones. We wouldn't say he's intelligent. He's a dumb dog or something like that. I found that very enriching. I'm not sure that people from artificial intelligence would see that, mainly with the discussion of the role of representations or seeing brains or manipulating signs, which is something that has been discussed through and through in artificial intelligence. That's my main point. I find it very deep, very complex. There's lots of things I must come back to reflect and see how your different arguments enrich the debate about the nature of intelligence. The second point is more critical for me, is that it's the concept of information and the concept of meaning that is inside your models. Regularly, you're talking about signs, different iconic indexes and symbols. And as far as I can see, they're Peircean-based topology. And in Pearson's presentations of the signs, the meaning is present by the interplay of the interpretant and the reference. You did not use these concepts. You went directly to the concept of information. And regularly you use the word meaning to talk about information. You say that it has information because it's meaningful. Is there a difference between the information and the meaning? If I'm in front of a sign, I want to, and I'm a Peircean view of the sign, as far as I can see where it goes, it's not the reference, it's not the object of the sign that is the information, but it would be in the interpretant. But if you put the information in the concept of interpretant, where does it work in that concept? The interpretant has a relation to the interpretation, but I have difficulty seeing where information is meaning in the sense of traditional semiotics. And the debate, and it was underlined with the past theory of communication, it seems sometimes that the information has something to do with the probability of appearing. This the classical concept of information, but the concept of information you're presenting is not just a probability of emerging. It has something else, and I'm trying to understand what it is if it's different from the meaning. So that would be my basic question in comparison to the first one. Thank you very much for this very rich presentation.
Thank you. Now let's hear Tiago Miller, who's a specialist in social communication biotechnology at the Catholic University Dom Bosco in Brazil.
Hello, good morning for everyone from Brazil. Sadowski, Professor, thank you so much for your presentation. It was fantastic. Particularly, I read your book, and I agree with some friends of mine that are participating from this meeting. I just have one question. That question is totally similar to the Professor Jan, because when I read your book, I saw some techniques that you describe, some models, how we can see the semiotic working with some etaps. But my question is, if there's a possibility that the reader will only direction his attention to elements that agree with his own meaning intention. And I mean, if the interpretant can fake some information, if the interpretant can just notice what he wants to notice during this meeting, during this intention. Thank you once again.
Okay. Thank you very much. Professor Sadowski, you have a lot to answer.
Yeah, I have a lot on my plate. Thank you, everyone, for comments, for input, for suggestions, for reaction. Never mind my presentation. You have covered a wide ground, and we have only so much time. And if I can go over the points you've made, however incompletely. Remo Gramigna, I think you were the first. Thank you for your comments. I have to confess, I'm not familiar with that publication. The book you showed me. Generally, I've read what I thought was necessary to ground my approach, my systemic approach to other systemic approaches. I'm aware of their existence. I quote some sources, some names in the book, not the one you showed, but we can only do so much. It's an enormously vast and diversified field. But thank you for that suggestion. And if you could perhaps email me the reference, because I didn't have time to write it down. But no, I didn't use it in my approach. What did inspire me were certain developments in the post-Second World War, not necessarily originally in semiotics, but in systems science. The work in cybernetics, the scholars such as Ludwig von Bertalanffy, Norbert Wiener, the Polish cyberneticist Marian Mazur, the systemic philosopher Erwin Laszlo, Hungarian. So it was a bit eclectic, but I decided rather than eclectically borrowing what's best in the field, starting with a simple model of the autonomous system, which a number of scholars have formulated, the concept of homeostasis, which is so crucial in biology, in living organisms, and start from there using logical transformations of certain premises. That's why I call my book a deductive study. So in a sense, I allowed logical deduction to work on the premises to generate various statements. What I have presented today is part of those definitions, concepts, classifications that I have generated. So it has evolved by itself, as it were, only partially inspired by existing publications and what has been done in the field. Biosemiotics, by all means, as you could see, I base my approach to communication and autonomous systems in natural sciences, in biology and in evolution. I was happy to find early in my research that I didn't even have to quote Darwin and the natural selection, etc., etc. I found, and it was a minor revelation, and I was very pleased to discover that evolution was actually built as a theoretical potential possibility in the very concept of the autonomous system. Namely, autonomous systems have to react to the stimuli appropriately in their interest in the name of survival. And given the competitive nature of the environment in which all living systems exist and operate, a system with built-in, innate, ready-made reactions to certain standard stimuli stands a better chance of surviving. In other words, evolution is a theoretical not only possibility, it's a must for autonomous systems to survive. They have to be born into this world with ready-made, inherited reactions, which evolutionary natural selection provides. So by all means, biosemiotics, and I would actually regard the approach, the model I have developed as an example of biosemiotics. Let me see. Yes, the artificial intelligence and deepfake images. What happens is, actually, I developed that point at some point in the book. It comes at the interface between, speaking of visual communication, iconic images and indexical images. Painting is an iconic form of communication, photography indexical. But today's technology with Photoshop and deepfake, etc., is able to generate iconic images that look like indexical images. Iconic images are not necessarily truthful. Actually, most of them are fictional. They can resemble existing reality. For instance, a painted portrait of someone who does exist, but not necessarily. Actually, most paintings are fictional. Fantastic images, religious painting, they exist in the imagination, the mind of believers, but for skeptics, they do not depict empirical reality. Photographs do. That's the nature of the medium. But if given the present technology, an iconic, basically iconic, that is potentially fictional image can be manipulated to look like a photograph, then it's deception. It's disinformation, unless it's presented as fake. But sometimes it isn't, and real people can, existing people can have images generated about them, static, photographic, or video images that look deceptively like indexical film footage. That's an unfortunate development of digital photography, that it can be processed. It still looks like an indexical medium, but it has lost its indexicality, that its truthfulness along the way. Yes, so indexicality has reference, and iconic images do not have a reference. They have a reference in the mind, in the imagination, but not in the empirical outside world. If I can move on to Roman Squeda. Homeostasis, yes, emotions certainly play a role in self-regulation. In fact, they motivate behavior. Information is what triggers a reaction, but for an autonomous system, and the more advanced, the more complex a system is, the more that it has a whole apparatus of emotions. In humans, it's the animal brain. It's the archaic part of the stem of our brain that generates those emotions, that can override more rational, clear-headed thinking. And actually, emotions can think, in a sense, for us by making us react instantly, usually in our interest, without having to process the information, analyze the situation, which will take time, and a fraction of a second may decide about survival. So emotions kick in instantly, bypassing the conscious mind, bypassing volition, and they are always present in varying degrees in communication. In fact, the classification of needs that I have proposed, I started with the most dynamic ones. What I actually called energy is a form of, it's another word for emotion, for instinct. So the most instinctive or most emotional needs, procreative, nutritional, protective, are mostly driven, motivated by emotions. Higher up, emotions become less powerful. Cognitive, rational analysis plays a greater part, and those needs are more, well, whether they are more advanced, in any case, they're more human. This is what defines human: intellectual, scientific, philosophical mind, etc., etc. It's more deliberate, cool-headed, less emotional. But emotions are certainly there, and they are the drivers, the motivators of action in response to informational stimulus. Robert Finkelstein, thank you for your comments. Artificial intelligence versus humans, machines communicating with one another. I know little about that. I didn't touch the question of artificial intelligence. I focused on the organic systems, autonomous systems, but it's certainly there. We hear about it. It's in the news every day, and it's often hyped up as something to worry about, certainly at the universities with ChatGPT and the students availing of an easy way, cheating by generating within seconds very thoughtful and intelligent essays, etc., etc. From what I know, it's not really my area. From what I understand, artificial intelligence has a certain type of thinking, processing of information, analyzing the data that is far superior to what the human brain can do in terms of speed, in terms of the information that artificial intelligence can process. It has a more capacious memory. It can retrieve, like any computer that we're using, it can retrieve the saved information quickly, and it bring it back in the accurate state in which it was saved. No loss of memory, no distortion, no corruption usually, which is not how our brains work. The main difference that I see between artificial intelligence, robots, self-regulating machines, self-driving cars, things like that, is that however complex and sophisticated these information processing machines are, they are still tools, hopefully, designed by humans and programmed by humans to perform certain tasks, not to be independent of human will. These machines, for all I know, have not developed, probably have no capacity, but you can correct me, to develop a mind of their own or will, a possibility of, for instance, saying no to the programmer, of dissent, of rebellion, etc., etc. This is the dystopian scenario familiar from science fiction, of futuristic fantasies. This is the supercomputer HAL from Stanley Kubrick's Space Odyssey, who takes over the control of the space mission, defying the humans. This is also the premise of Westworld, the film from the 70s, and the TV franchise following that, where androids, robots looking like humans, designed to serve humans, to satisfy their every whim, begin to malfunction or perhaps rebel against humans, etc., etc. I hope artificial intelligence does not pose a problem like that. It's still a tool to serve the designers, the human designers and users. If I can move on, Jean-Guy, what is intelligence? Indeed, we typically reserve the term intelligence to humans, although it's clear that certain animals appear to, the higher we go, the evolutionary ladder, the mammals in particular, and then the primates, it's obvious that these animals process more information, that the living environment, the environmental niche in which they operate, produces more stimuli, and they absorb, register, process more of those stimuli. Their social life is much more complex. So we can talk about intelligence, certainly. There is also a word that's often used, sentient creatures, which is usually applied to any creature with a nervous system. So probably plants would be excluded from that classification. Plants do react to external stimuli, but on the level of cells, by reacting through chemical reactions, but they don't have nervous systems. They don't store they can actually store information. They can learn. Yeah, I have to correct myself. But whether they are sentient creatures, it's up to how we define those concepts: intelligence, sentience, how much information, how the complexity of cognition and understanding and interpretation of information. So any definition can be arbitrarily limited or expanded, but certainly it applies to humans. Psychologists study it. IQ is a valid concept, measuring information in its various components, certainly. Information and meaning in Peirce's typology. I did mention certainly and acknowledged that indebtedness, the types of signs first identified by Peirce over 100 years ago. And I was actually, another small satisfaction from my research was that while I was deducing those concepts and classifications of signs using logical deduction, I arrived at certain concepts that Peirce had introduced already. So it was a validation. Philosophical concepts arrived at by Peirce over 100 years ago. I managed, even if Peirce had never lived, my logical deduction would have arrived at something similar. There's one correction which I noticed, but Peirce wasn't approaching the problem of communication and science from the point of view of the evolution in the biological world, that I switched the order of the concepts in Peirce's triad. He talks about icon, index, symbol. From the evolutionary point of view, I thought that indexes came earlier. Okay, they require less advanced cognitive dispositions than communicating through icons. So that's the only comment I had there. Information and meaning, what's the difference? I was following a working understanding, working definition of information as simply a difference from something else. Information is something that is different from something else. Something appears in a sensory range, in the visual field, for instance, that wasn't there before. That's information. The difference between light and darkness, that's information. Movement automatically generates information because a moving object changes its relation to other objects in space, and any change is information. In fact, there are animals who are blind unless something moves in their field of vision. So movement generates a difference automatically. A difference between one speech sound and another is information. A difference between silence and voice is information. So it's a simple but useful working definition of information. Meaning is a reaction to information. On its own, information, in the way I've worked it out for my purposes, information does not constitute meaning. A sentient system has to register that information and has to develop or evoke parainformation. Parainformation is meaning, whereas information is not meaning. For instance, when something happens and there's no sentient system present to witness it, information remains information without meaning. When a tree falls in the forest, it constitutes a physical state, potentially information if that fact is noticed by some sentient creature. Then it becomes information. On its own, when there is no witnesses from any sentient creatures, a fallen tree in the forest just constitutes a physical state, but no information. Once it's registered by a sentient creature, it becomes information. Once that sentient creature reacts to it in any way, that's the meaning of that information. If I can move on to Tiago. But disinformation, I think Tiago spoke about disinformation, and it indeed, yes, there was a section about it in my presentation. Disinformation as distinct from miscommunication. Those forms of communication refer to two types of situations, which are kind of fundamental for all living organisms. One, when systems cooperate, and they communicate by exchanging information that everyone can agree on, understanding, so that they can join forces and perform certain joint tasks which benefits everyone. But the living environment, universally, not the human society, but nature, is inherently competitive. There is never enough resources to go around for all organisms. They have to compete. They have to, and that often means that when they communicate, they withholding or falsifying information is more beneficial than communicating truthful information. Humans are adept in that. Unfortunately, it's rather depressing to see how much of disinformation, of lying, of pretending, of fabrication is going around in the public domain. It's depressing, if you like. But animals also use that. Camouflage is a form of disinformation, suppression of information. It's like sending a signal, I'm not there. Actually, there's no signal, in fact, but the hiding when insects scuttle to dark corners. They seek darkness to disappear because hiding is a safe strategy for them. So disinformation is part of communication, and it's interesting to study how actually clever and smart higher animals, primates, are at deception. In packs of apes, for instance, one animal can produce a vocal signal, a shriek, normally used to warn other members of the pack about some danger, the presence of a large cat or a snake, to make other animals scatter and run away. And that animal does this because it has spotted some food which it wants to itself. It doesn't want to share it and doesn't want other animals to know it's there. So it fakes a warning signal to manipulate other animals to scatter, to run away, so that it can avail itself of that piece of food. Very clever and very human, but it's deceptive, obviously. So please excuse this rambling response to your insightful comments. I think this is what we have time for.
Well, thank you very much for all your answers. Does anybody want to add something to the comments made by Professor Sadowski? Well, if nothing more to be added, then I want to thank you very much for your talk. It was really very insightful. And I want to thank all the panelists and Professor Buisac for putting together these web seminars, and for Zig to help with his technical support. And I hope to see you in the next web seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monica.
Thank you.
Thank you.